day, about our Ransom Weekly Wraps. I am Governor. This week we're going to start talking about the G20. Then we're going to look at China's recent plenum, which basically is a meeting they have every 5 years or so, where they decide a number of important things. There's been a purge happening there, and I think it's important to talk about that. Next, in the AI sections, we're going to talk about, again, moving on from the Chinese thing, China's plans going forward for AI. And then we'll look at Facebook, Meta, and some layoffs they've had recently. And finally, we'll discuss Amazon's leaked, plans for employment going forward. So let's start off with the G20. So the G20 is a group of the biggest, 20 biggest economies in the world. South Africa is, leading the next meeting. It's going to be in South Africa, it's, next few weeks. And basically, it's a chance for a smaller country like South Africa to kind of get a bigger stage, to talk about things that affect them or affect us, and groups that we try to represent. Now, the way I see the future of these kind of things, I think it's going to be less and less important going forward. Not to say they've been hugely important in the past. I mean, often these are just talk shops, and many discussions are made with not any concrete or important actions being actually decided here. But I think if you look at the way the world's going forward, there's three major blocks developing. There's the EU, there's the US, and there's China. Possibly in a few decades' time, it might be India as well. But right now, those are the three big blocks. Those are huge economies, relatively the same size, all of them. And they have their own particular, desires and needs, etc. Even if you look at who is the most aggressive and who's the most negative and so on, you could say that the Europeans are probably the nicest, in inverted commas, towards the emerging markets. But even they have their own restrictions. They have sneaky ways of basically fighting, for instance, exports of agricultural goods to the EU. The Chinese, want goods to natural resources, maybe markets to sell into. The Americans basically want a little more than that. Sometimes they want to control who the government is, and you can see that via the fact that we've seen, quite a few American sponsored plots to overthrow governments in Africa, the Middle East, South America, Asia, etc. So, what power does a country like South Africa have? We don't have the facility of the G20 to help us out when talking to the Americans or talking to the Chinese or talking to the Europeans. Well, going forward, I imagine that these three big powers, and like I said, maybe a couple of decades time, we might add India to that as well. These three big powers are in favor of more bilateral talks because it just helps them out. I mean, if it's South Africa and all of the emerging markets talking to China, China has to take us more seriously. If South Africa alone talking to China, China can bully us a bit. Same with the Americans, and even the same with the Europeans as well. As a plan going forward, I think we need to start seeing more cooperation among countries like South Africa, other African countries, maybe even adding in India, some of the Asian countries that are poor, like Sri Lanka and so on. South American countries, Brazil is quite a large country, but Venezuela would probably benefit from being part of a group. We're dealing with the US. There's been activity in the past around this kind of stuff. BRICS was supposed to be, helping, get with some of the larger emerging market countries: Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. Unfortunately, the makeup of that grouping is just not, there's no alignment between the parties. South Africa, Brazil, we commodity exporters. That's all we want to do is export our commodities. That's the main purpose we serve there. Russia has that military issues it has with the Ukrainians. Plus, of course, they're also commodity exporters. India, very poor country, but very large country. So therefore, as a whole, is got a lot of economic might, but individually very poor. Resources are poor. Wants to import more resources more cheaply, but it's not a huge manufacturing economy. China has a huge manufacturing sector, and also it's the same imports that the Indians have. So you look at a couple of things. For instance, commodities. Do we want commodity prices to go up or go down as BRICS? It's half and half. Next, do you want to basically get involved in geopolitical issues like the Russians are, or you just be more neutral like South Africa is? Do you want to basically have more international trade in manufactured goods, like the Chinese definitely want, or do you want to have a more protection economy, like for instance the Indians want? So it's not a defined kind of group that wants to work together. I think getting together a group that has similar interests, similar incentives would make a huge impact in terms of just how we are able to deal with this in the world. If we have groups get together just because of this name sounds nice, or we have some kind of political reason that we want to be together, it's not going to work. We need to align with countries that have the similar economic, political, and other interests we have. And that's one way to basically make sure that all our efforts are working in one direction. So like, what kind of things would you want? You'd want to, for instance, have, more freedom of trade, less tariffs. That would be better if we have all of the countries that basically want to export to the US work together. We want to have better prices for our commodities. Work together with other countries that are commodity exporters would help us out as well. So we need to have more alignment in that point of view. But I do think that the way the world is going forward, we can't deal with the way the world was in the past. I can't believe that that's going to continue going forward, because it isn't. The incentives just don't match that. We've got to develop new institutions, new relationships, new alliances effectively, that's going to champion our particular needs against some of the big boys out there, like the Chinese, the Europeans, and the Americans, and so on. Okay, now moving on and talk about the Chinese. The Chinese are having a meeting right this week where they have these meetings regularly, every 5 years, where they discuss the plans going forward and so on. We are going to have we've just had a purge. A lot of the very big generals have been removed, including the number 2 in charge of the military. And I understand the number 1 in charge of the military is Xi Jinping. So this is like a big, a check up there. We're talking about, almost 10 people being removed. The Chinese military is very important. To understand how important the Chinese military is, it's not the US military, which is about defending themselves against other parts of the world. Though recently we have seen the National Guard in the US, also go to your city. So maybe the world's getting more, unified, coming close together in the wrong way. But the CCP is the Chinese Communist Party. The Chinese military is there to protect the CCP. That's their goal. It's not to protect China. It's to protect the CCP. And without the Chinese military, the CCP basically doesn't function. It's a very interlinked organization. Just imagine if the purpose of the SANDF, the South African National Defence Force, was to protect the ANC, not protect South Africa. That's the kind of relationship they have. Many members of the military are part of the Chinese Communist Party. They are basically one of the same. It's a military wing of the Chinese Communist Party. So it's like, for instance, if MK was the SANDF in South Africa. Now, the purges happening here is something Xi Jinping has done in the past. He often purges people. He does not like to have any kind of, matchup in terms of power against himself. And the fact that he's doing it again shows that we may be a bit nervous about what's happening politically. He's had some missteps in the last few years. The Chinese are experiencing some major economic and other issues at the moment. And Xi Jinping basically, I think, wants to reign in power beyond anything else. And therefore, purging these members, I think, is something that he was going to have to do to make sure that there was no threat rising from him. The problem with this is that you keep on doing this for a few years, what's going to happen is Xi Jinping is not immortal. Despite what he said to Vladimir Putin, 150 is a possibility. In reality, he's probably not going to be around, in 30 years' time, especially not in the current state he is in right now. And we've seen with people like Robert Mugabe and other very old leaders in Africa, eventually as you get older and older and older, your capacities do go down. We talk about older leaders. I mean, Trump is almost 80 and Biden was 80. And you see what happens there. But the problem with this plan of removing all these rivals is when eventually the day comes where he has to be replaced, who do you have left over? All the good guys are probably being purged already. And I think that is the issue that the Chinese are really going to have to think about going forward, is the fact that their succession planning until Xi Jinping is pretty bad. Has been pretty good, but what's been happening now since Xi's been in power has been pretty bad. The Chinese basically are likely to go to a period of a significant instability when he does move on. And I do think that, though this might be good for him, it might even be good for the CCP in the short term, longer term, it's not a good thing for China. Now, talking about the Chinese plans going forward, we have the latest Chinese AI developments coming out. The Chinese are taking AI very seriously. They're talking about integrating it much more into their economy, into their military, and so on. There are talks about how they want to be the center of AI development in 5 years' time. Now, China has many advantages. A lot of the people involved in AI research, just like the researchers themselves, have Chinese backgrounds. Good schooling system, large population, focus on education. You get a lot of people who are very highly educated, of Chinese origin that are, in these AI companies. The guy running, Meta system is of Chinese origin as well. He's not Chinese, but he's of Chinese origin. And we'll talk about that in a second. But So they have a lot of brain power there. But what they don't have is what the US has, which is these very deep capital markets. And you may think, capital markets, what do they actually help out? I mean, I'm a stockbroker and I'm pushing up capital markets because they're important. To see how important capital markets are, the Dutch had capital markets first and they almost ruled the world. That's why people speak Afrikaans in South Africa. Think about it. The Netherlands is a tiny little country, and yet people in South Africa speak Afrikaans, which is a variation of Dutch. Why? Because they had the Dutch East India Company, which is a capital market allowing them to expand quickly. The Chinese don't have this. They can't raise the capital the Americans can raise. They don't have access to that kind of funding. And the Americans have not just access to funding, but they have a very open capital market, very competitive capital market that allows them to basically have these companies developing very quickly. OpenAI is a $500 billion company. You know what I mean? SpaceX, all these kind of companies are developing really fast in the US because they have the capital markets they can work with. The Chinese don't have this, and therefore they are much less able to develop new technologies very quickly. But here's the thing that they do have. Once they have a technology up and running, they have the ability to really allow a local champion to take a great stake going forward and to really just support them. So the Chinese system works like this. What they do is allow a lot of tiny companies to compete, and whoever wins out, they basically becomes the champion and they try and support. So it is possible that the Chinese, with their advantages around, for instance, the manpower and so on, could take a lead by 2030, all else being equal in AI development. But I do think that the challenge they face is quite high. And if you had to bet money on it, I would probably put my money more on the US than on the Chinese in 2030. But the fact that they're focusing so hard on it is important because they are going to be able to do things that the Americans can't do, most notably around energy. Now, the Chinese basically are building huge amounts of energy at the moment. They're adding like the entire US grid amount of energy like every few years. The US, on the other hand, has not been able to build as much because of regulations and other things. I mean, to build a nuclear power plant in the US, technically it would only take a couple of years. It's more likely to take a couple of decades because of regulations and permitting and so on. Coal power plants, very hard to build in the US. Even gas turbines, it's difficult to build. The one thing that you can actually build in the US is solar reasonably quickly, but even that, with the latest regulations from the Trump administration, is going to be coming under pressure. I think they will probably have to reverse that because it's such a stupid idea that they will have to reverse it. But at the moment, even that is under pressure. The Chinese, on the other hand, say build energy, they build energy. They say move 3 million people to build the Three Gorges Dam. They move those people. And so I think the Chinese are going to have an advantage with energy. Why is that important? Well, one of the things that data centers really need is energy. And if you don't have the best chips out there, what you can do is have more of the chips, use more of the energy and get kind of similar kind of a result. And so what you're going to do right now is you're going to see the Chinese possibly operating with lower level tech, but using other factors like their energy, like their IQ, like the intellectual property of their workers, like the best scientists, the numbers of people that put into this thing. They're going to use that to try and make up the difference. And maybe they will be able to. I mean, if you look at, for instance, the US and Russia with the space race, the US had a lot of advantages and they eventually won it. But the Russians kept in contact for a long time. Why? Because they were able to do things that the US was not able to do, for instance, around safety for astronauts and so on, or cosmonauts as they were called. And I think the Chinese are going to have to use those kind of advantages as well to try and push themselves forward. Next, talking about AI, we have seen Meta, this is Facebook's parent company, lay off a number of workers in the last few days, AI workers especially. A person called Alexander Wang is a new hire that they've had recently. They kind of acqui-hired his company, so they spent billions of dollars to basically buy the company out to get him to be in charge of their AI division. He's kind of like semi-replacing a guy called Jan LeCun. Jan LeCun is one of the godfathers of AI, big scientist and so on, but he has some very conservative views about what AI is likely to do. So he's quite pessimistic about AI developing going forward. He doesn't think, for instance, it's going to happen by 2030, 2035 even. Maybe it'll take multiple decades more than that. Alexander Wang is more in the kind of like the stream of people like Elon Musk or Sam Altman or Tara Emery, where he's basically much more optimistic about AI. And here's the thing, by pushing forward like this, by saying, okay, we are going to go forward and we're going to really push and try and get this thing sorted out, even if we are not as realistic about the timeline, the effort itself is probably going to result in greater development. And I think the fact that if you're pessimistic, you probably sometimes make the pessimism a reality. If you're optimistic, simply makes the optimism a reality. And I think that's a case that Mark Zuckerberg is seeing here, and that's why he's focusing on this. as he has said recently, he's willing to waste a couple $100 billion if it means that he's better able to keep up with the AI race. I've mentioned this in the past, and I want you to understand that it's psychology here that matters. We have a bunch of people. The youngest of them is Mark Zuckerberg. Most of these guys are like in their 50s. Some of them even older. These are the people in charge of spending for these companies. These are men that are approaching a point in their life where they are seeing the end coming. That's why people have midlife crises around this time and so on. Now, to many of these guys, they're seeing a chance at, immortality, even literal immortality, or maybe figurative immortality, by being the people that develop artificial intelligence. And so, if you're worth hundreds of billions of dollars, as most of these guys are, if you have even the guys in charge of Apple and Microsoft, these guys are worth billions. Even the guy in charge of Google is worth billions. Though you cannot say maybe he's not totally in charge because he's not the controlling shares. But the guys that do have the controlling shares are worth hundreds of billions. And by the way, the guys in charge of Google, both Sergey Brin and Larry Page, have health issues that are quite a bit more pressing than for instance just aging. And for someone like that who has health issues, who sees a possibility of curing those health issues with the help of AI, you're going to be able to risk more money than you otherwise would have been to get AI going. Larry Page has, for instance, said he's willing to go bankrupt to get AI at Google, at Alphabet. Bankrupt for him probably means getting down to a couple $1 billion, which is still a fun life to live, But he's willing to risk those hundreds of billions to get to that point. And so we are likely to see this more aggressive stance going forward. Now, speaking of Alexander Wang, he's laid off a lot of workers. From what I can gather, not all these workers are bad workers, because when you see them bring up their little things on X about how they've been let go, all I can see below them is job offers, from everybody, even from Apple, from XAI, from companies I've never heard of before. Everybody wants to hire these guys because they're not bad workers. So it could be that maybe he's cutting too close to the bone around these things, but I think you're likely to see Meta taking a far more aggressive stance on AI than we have seen in the past. Even though like Llama, etc. have been good things, I think we're going to see much more aggressive actions from Meta going forward, because Alexander Wang is showing that he's taking a very more hands-on aggressive approach to it. And by the way, his name is Alexander, but it's without the E at the end. It says a DR at the end. Okay. And then moving on to other job numbers from AI, we saw a leaked report apparently from Amazon talking about their plans for hiring for the next 5 years or so. And basically what this turns out to be is that without AI, Amazon was probably going to hire somewhere like 600,000 more people by 2030 than it is probably currently going to do. So the net amount of people we're talking about that Amazon is seeing that AI is going to stop them from hiring is about 600,000 people. That's a lot of people. Even for a place like the US, that's a lot of people. Okay, 600,000 people will be seen on unemployment figures in terms of percentage changing. And then the only one, we've seen Nestle come out and talk about 15,000 workers, mostly white collar workers, which is being removed. Now, here's the thing I propose I'm putting to you. Most white collar work is zero sum. For instance, what I do, train the market. If I got like 10 times smarter, and everybody else in the market also got 10 times smarter, then the effect on picking the right shares would be zero, because we would all challenge each other, because we are basically working each other. Imagine lawyers. Imagine there's like 10 times more lawyers in the world. So I have 10 times more lawyers on my side. You have 10 times more lawyers on your side. Does it result in more productivity in the world? No. Can you imagine even things like books and movies and so on? There's always a number one movie in the world. There's always a number one book in the world. Occasionally you have something like Harry Potter that comes out and like changes demographics for a while. But basically it's like a zero sum game. If I have the number one movie in the world, you don't. If you're going to watch my movie, you're not going to watch yours. If they're going to basically read my book, they're going to read yours. That is almost a zero sum game. So if there's 1,000 times more ability to read books in the world, there will not be 1,000 times more GDP from books, if you know what I mean. And I do think that's important going forward. If you're going to see higher levels of unemployment, but GDP not rising as fast as we would like to compensate for that, it's going to be a very difficult time economically for the world, especially in terms of like stability, etc. Even if it might not show through in the GDP numbers. Okay, that's it for this week. Thanks for having me, and I look forward to seeing you next week. Cheers.